Look, if you had one shot.
All right. Welcome. I hope that sound worked. I've been trying to get the sound thing. All right. Welcome to my video on some of the story things that we're working on in class. Give me a second here while I share my screen and get this rolling. A very stubborn program. It always wants to do the thing I don't want it to do. All right. So today I'm going to talk about point of view, characters, and dialogue, starting your stories, character goals and stakes. Make it sound like real people. So, um, where do ideas come from? Writers get this question all the time. Um, Typically from people who may not be getting any ideas, because the answer that a lot of writers give to this question is like, what do you mean you don't get ideas? Here, I'm trying to resize my face. Um, the ideas just come. Um, and as I wrote about in my blog that you may have read, I wrote this story called Sodium, in which I really felt like suddenly I was receiving a transmission from, I called it Pluto, but some other dimension. I mean, literally all of a sudden, as I was driving home from being somewhere, this story, it was like it downloaded itself into my head. It was like I had to go and I had to sit down and I had to channel it, um, and just receive the transmission. Now, it doesn't always happen like that, right? And that's why, writers can't really explain where ideas come from. But one moment that I had when I was learning creative writing and in creative writing classes in college was working one on one with the published writer. And she said, "Do you start with character?" And I realized that I wasn't really starting with character, right? I came from a background in comic books and fantasy novels like Lord of the Rings and science fiction novels like Dune and The Left Hand of Darkness and Childhood's End. And I was really more interested in the premise of the story, the big picture, and world building and games like Dungeons and Dragons, which I also played, really fed into that sort of I have to build the world before I can think about the character. But role-playing games also teach you to think about the character. And early role-playing games didn't really get us to think about who the character is. They were all pretty generic. And what we'll learn about is a flat character, right? So it really depends on genre, right? In terms of where your story begins. It's not that you have to start with thinking about character first, because if you don't really have a clear idea of your world, especially if you're writing in a genre like science fiction, fantasy, horror, those kinds of things, then the character is going to be a little bit harder to create, right? Whereas, maybe back in the early days of Marvel Comics, when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created Spider-Man, even though, important note, Jack Kirby actually drew the original picture of Spider-Man with his costume. They probably created the idea of Spider-Man. Okay, we're gonna have a character with spider powers. So who is he? How does he get these powers? What are the people in his life? That sort of thing, right? And Neil Gaiman talks about where ideas come from as well. But sometimes, they just hit you like a transmission from out of the blue, and you have to be ready to receive the transmission. Not everybody has that experience, but many do. Um, so, who is your main character? I'm going to move my face around. um, you know, um, the character has to have goals. What does the character want? This is the like really important thing to think about early on in your writing process. What is the thing the character most wants in general in life? And then what does the character want, particularly in this story? Now, sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes the character has a goal in the moment, and a larger goal in life. This is kind of seen in Omakase, the story in week two, um, which I think the main character very much has that dual kind of a thing. She has a goal in the moment, but she also has like larger goals, you know. And so, what are the stakes? You know, if a character doesn't have anything on the line, if a character doesn't have any kind of a jeopardy, if there isn't any conflict in the story, then the story's not very interesting, right? And the conflict doesn't always have to be with other people, though it often is, right? Sometimes the character is in conflict with himself or herself, or themselves. Sometimes the character is in conflict with the world around them, right? Not necessarily with other people, though often, right? So thinking about these things mindfully, you know, what are the character's goals? What does the character want? Um, and again, you know, people in theater learn this, right? You know, that, you know, what, you know, a character enters a scene. What does the character want in this scene? What are they trying to accomplish in this moment, as opposed to what their larger goals might be, right? Um, and what traits does the character have? Is a character insecure? Is a character addicted to something? You know, like if you know anything about these characters, you know what their traits are. You know, Captain America is extremely noble. He believes in these American ideals that he thinks are the spirit of America. He believes in justice, um, and he always tries to do the right thing. Now, sometimes his idea of what the right thing is not necessarily the right thing in the eyes of other people. Um, you know, but I mean, it's pretty clear we can define, you know, Captain America. You know, he's not a super complicated character, right? Um, and you know, I mean, you could say that his flaws are sort of this adherence to this idea of justice and doing the right thing, um, and trying to kind of see the world in black and white and having a hard time with the gray areas, right? But other people might have serious flaws, serious things that get in the way. You know, maybe they're you know physically um, um, not as strong as Captain America and easily injured, right? Or maybe they have an obsession. I'm particularly interested in characters with obsessions, things that override everything else. Um, but then also, what are the character's strengths? And I kind of talked about strengths with, you know, Captain America, but it's a good idea to think about these things with your main character. Certainly, all your other characters, you should have a good idea of who they are and what all these things are. But it starts with the main character, because the main character is going to drive the story. So that's why my teacher asked me that. You know, if I start with the main character as I'm you know, conceiving the story and I figure these things out, what does the character want? That kind of opens up the story, you know. You know, if the character is seeking revenge against people that killed his wife, for example, um, you know, then I know what the character wants, right? You know, and I know what the stakes are, and you know that just creates the whole story around that, you know, that idea. Whereas, you know, we look at a story like Lord of the Rings, probably wasn't conceived that way, right? You know, like you know, Tolkien was creating the whole world, you know, and he, you know, created the rings and Mordor and Sauron and all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, okay, what happens? You know, who's going to, you know, destroy the ring? And then he starts to think about the characters, you know, but it's probably the world and the premise came first. So everything, you know, the thing about writing rules is that they're not 100%, as I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. They're not 100%. There are always exceptions and times to break them or not pay attention to them, right? But these are good things to think about. And you'll have other assignments in week two of this course, assuming that I'm using this video for this course, where you'll be able to think about these things. Um, Going back to my story of sodium, you know, it didn't. necessarily start with character. Wait, this is the previous. I always do that. I hit previous instead of next. I want this one. All right. It's often helpful to come up with your story hook. Stories or novels or whatever you're writing should start with something that grabs the reader's attention, right? And one of the don'ts that you'll find in writing advice is don't start with dialogue. And I have to ask, why not? Um, the reason is that if there's too much dialogue, because dialogue, by the definition of the word, implies two people, right? Talking to each other, right? And if you immediately start with two people talking to each other and we don't know who the people are, we're not going to be very invested in the story, right? My exception was when I wrote a Star Trek novel, which I did not get published, so don't go looking for it. But I wrote a Star Trek novel, and it was set in the original, cast with Captain Kirk and Spock and all those characters. And the first line of the novel was Kirk, a line of Kirk dialogue, in which he says, "What do you mean you're going to sell it to the Klingons?" Now, anybody reading this book knows Star Trek. It's unlikely this is someone's introduction to Star Trek. But even if it isn't, I'm not going to have a whole bunch of dialogue before I explain where we are, who said that, why they said that, and set the scene, right? Because setting the scene is the extremely important thing. And there's something I recommend doing. I do it a lot, often in the bookstore, but you could do it on the internet as well, is I'll read, I like to go around the bookstore and read, the first paragraph of books, but also just like chapter starters, which can be dicey if you want to avoid spoilers. And often after I've read a book, I go back through it and look at how the author has started the chapters, and how they've set the scene. What's the first line? How is that functioning, to give the reader what they need to understand, right? And so I thought this was a good example of breaking that rule about not starting with dialogue. 'Cause it's just one line, and likely the reader already knows who Captain Kirk is, knows who Klingons are, knows about Star Trek. So if I start with, "What do you mean you're going to sell it to the Klingons?" It's kind of funny, gets the reader into the story, and then immediately, I explain where Captain Kirk is, why he said that, who he's talking to, what the thing is that's getting sold to the Klingons instead of the Federation, et cetera, et cetera. That all gets filled in. But the scene is starting to unfurl. I don't like, I'm careful. This is another thing to think about is, how you give information to the reader, right? Because if you dump too much information, and literally if you go reading writing advice, it is called info dump. If you dump information on the reader in too big of chunks, or a gigantic chunk, it's going to disengage the reader. That was really a purpose in asking readers to think about, when are you pulled out of the story, right? And it's usually when the narrative has kind of faltered, right? Where there's too much exposition, or rather too much telling and not enough showing. Okay. Um, okay, I'm going to click next. So here is my start for that sodium story that I felt got beamed into my head. In eighth grade, we knew our lives were going to end. Now, that alone, I think, is a pretty solid first sentence. Um, but I gave you the next two because I think it gives a bigger picture. Well, at least I did. One day you can be on top, king of the hill. The next day you have to clean the blood off the sidewalk where somebody had been stabbed the night before. This should intrigue you to want to keep reading the story. But we also learn a lot right away in three sentences. First, characters are in eighth grade, or at least it's referencing eighth grade, and there's a group of them because there's a we. And the story is going to be in first person because we have an I, that is telling the story. But there are also it's the formal rules of writing are not exactly firmly adhered to because we shift briefly into second person. One day you can be directly addressing the reader, right? But that's because the first person narrator is telling you, the reader, a story and can say you. Um, and we know that we mean everyone, right? Plus, we set up the idea of death in two parts. We knew our lives were going to end, which doesn't sound like we're going to die someday. It sounds more like we're putting ourselves in a dangerous situation, and we might not live. And also, the cleaning the blood off the sidewalk, that's a pretty vivid image that'll make you curious about what that is about. Um, so, um, one of the first things to think about when you're trying to come up with your hook. And I'll talk for a little while later about why you don't have to start your writing process with your hook. Start at the start of the story. But you need to understand what point of view you're going to take. And that also comes from understanding your main character. So this is first person, right? The character is telling you the story in referring to themselves as I, and telling you about what's going on. And in a setup like that, you have to come up with a way to let the reader know what the main character's name is at some point because they're telling you the story. They're not, unless they're going to say, like in the previous slide, my name is Captain America. You got to come up with some way to do that. Limited third person is where you stick with one particular character's point of view, but they're not telling you the story. You're telling the story about them. And so it's he, she, they. Distance in third person, those are third person pronouns. Um, in most fiction is either in first or limited third. And a lot of novels have multiple character point of views in limited third. Like if you think of Game of Thrones, his very famous George R. R. Martin first book of his series is Songs of Ice and Fire. He's got multiple. He's got like 9 or 10 point of view characters, and you keep switching back and forth between them in the novel. But each chapter is limited to just that point of view character's point of view. So you don't find out what Arya is doing when you're reading the Bran chapter. You only find out what Bran is doing, what Bran knows, what Bran sees. And Bran is not privy to what Arya is seeing and doing. Third, omniscient. A lot of stories have been told in that point of view, particularly in the past, and it gives you the opportunity to hop between heads within a single story or chapter. It's harder to pull off than limited, and it's not used as often. Second person for the whole story is a much more modern thing, like Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney is a pretty famous example of a whole novel written in you, directly addressing the reader, where the reader sort of becomes the main character because it's you do this and you do that all the way through the whole book. So those are things to think about. By the way, one of my famous comic strips, X XKCD, XKCD. That's what the cartoon is. So some notable books while I conclude this um, little presentation, because I think it's important to start sharing some notable books with you and kind of talk about them, right? So one of my favorite books of the last several years is A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. It's a story of a woman who is a serial killer and she lures men and kills them and eats them. And she doesn't just eat them, she prepares them in kind of a gourmet cuisine kind of way. Um, and I believe it's told in first person. I didn't go grab my copy. I'm going to do something I can do because I can do it. I'm going to pause the recording. I'm going to go grab my copy. So it is told in first person. And it's a very adult book. Yeah, there is some sex mixed in with, obviously, with the killing. And she's a food critic. So she loves food. She writes about food. Um, It's a fantastic book. I really loved it. But it really is a good portrait of creating first-person character. Um, this character is very specific traits, goals, flaws, stakes. Of course, she's killing men and could get caught. Uh, so fantastic, right? Sometimes, though, the premise and the character kind of come together at the same time, right? I think both of these stories are example of that, right? So a certain hunger is, well, what if there was a woman serial killer, and kind of with a cannibalism theme, right? So I mean, that would make my mind jump to, well, what if she's a food critic or a foodie or a chef or immediately I'm going to start going down that direction. I suspect that might have been the thought process, right? First 15 Lives of Harry August, the premise comes right along with the character, right? So the premise of this book is it's a take on both immortality and time travel. It's a really, really brilliant book. And in this world, the characters live out their life. So say I live until I'm 85 and then I die. Okay. When I wake up again, I've been reborn from back where my original birth was, to live my life over again. Um, and in that, come about the age of 3 or so, I remember my previous lives, right? It's time travel in that there's lots of people that can do this, and so they can send messages back in time. If you read it, you'll get a better explanation than I'm going to give you here. But obviously, once you have this premise for the idea of this kind of immortality, then you're going to create a character that's going to tell the story. And this, again, first person narrative, Harry August is the main character, and so at first, he doesn't understand what's happening to him. It's a while before he discovers there's other people that have the same ability, that can do this. And then, what goes from there, what, happens next. Because what happens next is what drives us through stories. What is going to happen? Um, Lastly, two more. If we were villains, is kind of dark academia. So where the other two books are more focused on single characters, these books are focused on multiple characters, right? And so lots of dialogue. And studying how writers write dialogue gives us a really good idea of, how they talk like real people. And in fact, screenwriting, looking at screenplays or theatrical plays is even better way to study how people talk. Because you can't exactly take the way people really talk. It's not like you can just make an audio recording where you are somewhere and transcribe that and it'll work well as fiction, right? Because the way we really talk isn't really good to read very often, right? You'll get some good stuff, but you can't just transcribe it, right? You have to make it work as fiction. If We Were Villains is a book that was recommended to me by a close friend of mine who is writing a similar book. And there aren't a lot of dark academia books, uh, but this one starts with the main character explaining a murder that took place that he was sentenced to prison for committing. And I say that very carefully, the way I said it. And I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say anything more than that. So you go back in time because he's been in prison for like 10 years, and you get this whole story of these kids at a college campus, and ultimately there's going to be a murder, at least one, because that's what he was, in prison for, and he's telling the story. Um, and It's just got great dialogue. It's got great multiple characters, and it's really, really grounded in theater. It's got a lot of Shakespeare in it, but not Shakespeare that would be off-putting for people that don't know or even like Shakespeare. It's this really good flavor because the characters are all actors in Shakespearean repertory company. They perform Shakespearean plays. Really fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough. And lastly, you may have heard of all four of these books, this is the one you probably have heard of, is Rebecca Yarros's Fourth Wing, which I ultimately had to read because so many people were crazy about it. Um, and I think I wrote about this in the classroom somewhere, that Portland Book Fest in 2025 was basically sold out because Rebecca Yarros was there. And it was insane the number of people. I hadn't read her books yet. She's basically responsible for creating romantasy as a new genre, a blend of romance and fantasy. But so this is strongly a romance novel, but for adults. It's new adult, not young adult, because it's got explicit sex with explicit language. And it's got heat buildup to those sex scenes. Um, there's at least one per book. Um, I'm currently reading the third book, which will no longer be true if I reuse this video at some point in the future. Um, I found that there were some flaws in terms of my regard for her book, but they kind of faded away the more I read. I thought it was rough at the beginning of this, the first book, but it got better. But I think one of her strengths is dialogue. She's really good at defining her characters and having them talk the way they talk. And nobody talks like the way, they all talk in a very particular way that is particular to them and who they are as people. And she's really fantastic at that. And she's got lots of characters in this book and the other books. So the other thing that she's really great at is narrative, fast-paced action, and cliffhanger ends to chapters. Really fantastic. Make you want to, like my good friend who recommended If We Were Villains, also recommended Fourth Wing. She calls it dragon crack. In other words, it's addictive, like crack, but it's about dragons. So I hope I bent your ear enough. I hope you found this useful and interesting. Now get writing. There's a picture of me eating dried grasshoppers, and just in case you wonder what I'm doing. Um, and last bit of advice. You don't have to start with your story hook. If you get a good idea for a story hook, start with your story hook. I mean, when I wrote the Star Trek novel, I had that line. What do you mean you're going to write what do you mean you're going to sell it to the clans? When I wrote Sodium, it was being beamed into my head. So, it felt like I was channeling it. So I had that line. Other times I don't know how the story is going to start right away, or the chapter, or whatever it is I'm working on. And here's the thing that is amazing in our modern world that I know but maybe you don't really think about, is that you have a computer. You have a computer. You can instantly, in the blink of an eye, insert something in the middle of a bunch of digital text. You can move things around. You don't have to write it in the order that it will ultimately appear in. If you have the scene for, something that happens in the middle or near the end of the story, write it. Write it out. Write that now. You don't have to wait until you get there. You can just write that. And maybe you don't have it in the final form. That's okay. You can just kind of sketch it out. Often when I start to have dialogue for how characters are going to interact, I just write the dialogue. I don't worry about the tags. I don't worry about description. I don't worry about the quotation marks. I don't worry about anything. I just write out the things they're saying. And if I have to keep track of who's saying what for my own benefit, so I remember, then I put in some tags. But and by tags, it's the he said, she said. Thomar said. Thomar is one of my characters. But you don't have to write in order. Um, so don't wait to start your story till you have a great idea for a hook. Probably if you start writing your story and you start building it out from the middle, or you write the ending, if you know what the ending is, that ultimately a hook will come to you. And sometimes the first hook's not the best one that you get the idea for. So the most important thing is just to write. Whatever you have in your head, get it out onto the screen or onto paper, however you do it. All right, we'll be seeing you around. Thanks for listening. Oh, I can end. Where? Ah! The new Zoom has really confused me.